Yes, no questions.
We're allowed to ask you questions?
Sure.
When it comes to Noah's Ark and the idea of the flood destroying humanity, and then on top of that, having like civilization rebuild itself for like all of the different cultures, languages, traditions, what have you, over what is it, 4,000 year period ish? How do we make sense of that narrative and the fact that even if it was a localized flood, how do so many cultures have their own flood story?
Right. Okay, good. What other questions do we have? Again, could be on stuff from this morning, could be on general stuff. Yes.
To complement that, also, it was supposed to be that Noah took 2 of every non-kosher species and 7 of every kosher species. Like, is it really reasonable that he had every single species in the entire earth with him?
Good. Yeah.
I did a bit about how did people live so long in the years following God?
Following God. Okay, good. Yeah.
I hear that early on in biblical history, at least, that humans were born in their full size and I think there is like an understanding that they were even like much larger than humans are today. How do we reconcile that? And like, we haven't obviously found any bones of humans like that today. I've heard that like they were done away with during the flood, and that's a response from the rabbi. But I guess like if you could expand on that.
Yeah.
Giants, pretty crazy. Like, how do you rationalize? Sort of very, they existed, they were active or something.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Any other questions you want to throw in? Yeah.
Is there any Torah perspective on AI and that plays a role in redemption?
Okay. I'm going to capture Paul. What's that?
We had the questions from like 2 weeks ago that we said we're possibly going to catch up on.
Yeah, go on. Which ones?
Was it me and you? Me and another guy. It was like spiritual and Kabbalistic and how that sort of matched it. We were talking about reincarnation.
Okay.
We had the whole list.
Yes, no, I thought we'd gone through most of them. But okay, if there's any on that, remind me with pleasure. So reincarnation, want to know about what else?
It was me, but personally I want to prioritize the flood stuff.
Let me give you a very big rule, because most of the questions today come from the first 11 chapters of Torah. Okay, last week we spoke about the Garden of Eden, but it's not actually even in our calendar, it's a transcendent realm. The question is, when do we exactly enter the realm at which we expect science and Torah as a language to be close enough to one another that if you read a verse in the Torah, you would know what you're looking for scientifically, right? It's not in the first 2 or 3 chapters, so when is it? So there's a very important teaching of Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. Again, I don't remember whether we touched on this last week or not, but he is a very important figure because what he did with Kabbalah is show that it was really a philosophical system. Okay, certain individuals play a very strong role in Jewish history because they articulate something that was there, but they demonstrate how to do it, and it creates a paradigm shift in our understanding. By really, Kabbalah was a very was contained in relatively small, I wouldn't say secretive groups, but relatively small groups. We don't see lots of it before around. I mean, we get little bits popping around in various places. We have in Tanakh itself, we have mystical chapters. In the Talmud speaks about the mystical chapters of the Tanakh, the biblical prophecies. There were groups, there were various midrashim that are clearly touching upon the mystical inner realm, God's throne. You have the Sefer Yetzirah, although some try to interpret it philosophically, mathematically, it does look much more like a mystical text. There's been stuff around, but when the Ramban, when Nachmanides in his Torah commentary talks about the Derech HaEmes, the way of truth, he's clearly relating to scholars who understand some body of concepts, but were not really written about a lot prior to that. From around the 13th century, once the Zohar is out there in circulation, things start to change very strongly. And between the 13th and 17th century, of course, you've got the Arizal, who's now creating a whole rich system of understanding the Zohar, and the more anthropomorphic parts of the Zohar and what they all mean. And so Ramchal comes along and says, you have to understand what's really going on over here. This is all about understanding. From Tanakh onwards, it's not about knowing there's a mystical object there and a spiritual abstract thing there. Why would we care? It's about understanding God's interaction with the world. Everything the prophets are talking about is God's interaction with the world. Everything is, as I said last time, fundamentally prescriptive, trying to get you to understand what to do. That means you can also understand the world as God communicating with us, and history as God communicating with us. And all the Kabbalistic structures are really patterns of divine interaction in the world. That's what he says. So Ramchal is a very important figure because he shows us how that works. And from then onwards it becomes a natural way of thinking. But he is amongst the many things he says, and that's why very often we're studying Ramchal's text as opposed to the primary literature. Before a person will be reading the Arizal, the Eitz Chaim, all these kind of real, what's considered primary Kabbalistic material, they're often reading Ramchal. And Ramchal, through his life, it was a very short life. His early stuff was mostly locked away. It was actually, a lot of rabbis were suspicious he was going to be a Sabbatean, get at the history and the background you know, and a lot of his early material had to be put away. But as his life went on, it was like a ladder coming down to earth. So you may encounter texts like the Path of the Just, Silas Yesharim, which is more or less the last thing he wrote in Amsterdam. There, he lived in Italy early life, went for a few years to Amsterdam, came to Israel and died. I don't think we have a single writing of him from Israel. The writings in Amsterdam are much more the ones that are in popular circulation, Derech Hashem, the way of God, right? These sorts of works. But you can kind of climb up the ladder of him inwards. Now, in one of his writings from this relatively early period called the Adir B'Maron, which is a commentary on one of the most esoteric parts of the Zohar, he makes the following statement. He doesn't discuss where it's sourced, but presumably it's in the Arizal's material in the Zohar, and he may feel it's more or less explicit in the Torah itself, is that the first 11 chapters of Torah are very different to the rest of the Torah. He makes a sharp distinction between what we call today the first 11 chapters, right? He doesn't use the word 11 chapters, but he means the pre-Abrahamic part of Torah, and then from Abraham's journey onwards. So the first 20 generations, the ones who have these super long lifespans, the ones for whom is the Garden of Eden story, the flood story, the Tower of Babylon story. Those three stories, according to Ramchal, are not to be looked at in the same way as the rest of Torah, which does not mean they didn't happen. He holds they did happen. I'll tell you what he says, and then I'll tell you there's at least two ways to understand what he says. Again, he's not trying to reconcile that with science because there was no scientific data at the time to cast any doubt on the veracity of the story. He's saying it purely internally to the internal logic of Torah and the systems that we have revealed to us. So that's very helpful because it's not an ad hoc response to a scientific problem, which is always a little suspect. It doesn't mean it's not true. Scientific information can force you to rethink something, but he's saying this before the advent of geology and paleontology and all these things that have made us think differently about stuff. He says the Torah itself, and he describes the world in the following way. He says that there's many different patterns God uses to interact with the world, but there are two primary patterns. In Kabbalistic language, one is called Arich Ampin, or the long face of God, and one is called Zer Ampin, or the short face of God. Okay, there's the short face of God, which means God interacts in the short and the immediate, and there's the long face of God, which means God interacts in the big picture. What's the practical ramification of the two? So elsewhere, Ramchal tells us that the so-called long face means God is looking at the long arc of history and shaping every variable of history so that it will all come together in this incredible crescendo at the end in which God's oneness will be revealed. Okay? So history has a long arc. No matter what we're doing, and as we can choose how the story goes, we can choose which particular novel we're doing, but you know in the end it's going to form a little twist and it's all going to come, every detail is going to end up being in the revelation. You might think, so why does that give us free will? I give an analogy to this. I don't know if, when we were kids, there was a very popular author called Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie's stories were all the same and all different. They were all the same, and they were detective novels, where all the way through the story you don't know what's going on. And you can't see necessarily for yourself. Sometimes you're led down the wrong path. Until the final chapter, you are very unlikely to know who the real suspect is. And all of a sudden in the last chapter, you know there's going to be this amazing twist where Poirot, or whoever the key detective is, not always the same one, is going to show you how everything was really, if you put it all together, you can see this. That's like a metaphor for history, which is that no matter what pathway we choose, God will be able to show at the end that it all comes together and produces the revelation of God. But what the story is, that's us. Each story she writes a different story. We're writing the story. Okay? Does that make sense to people? So Arich Anpin means that God is driving history so that it will reveal the oneness of God. It will show how every single detail that happened in history was somehow working together for the oneness of God. Yeah?
But then does he not know what we'll choose?
No. Well, okay, God's knowledge and free will is a separate topic. If we have time, maybe we'll touch upon it. And the Hilchos Tshuva talks, I talked about it last week, I'm happy to bring it back again here. But it doesn't impact this, because on some level we're going to say we do have free will, with or without God's knowledge of that free will. Even if God does know it, we're going to somehow say we do have free will, and free will means you genuinely can shape history in very dramatic ways. We can really build it. For example, a very good example of this is the Purim story. Again, for those who are familiar with the book of Esther and the celebration of Purim, all the choices, the major choices are all made by Haman, the evil anti-Semite who's trying to destroy the Jewish people. He makes pretty much every major choice in the entire story, and still the story arcs to the revelation of God. Right? Now, at a key point, Esther, the queen, who's a closet Jew basically, suddenly reveals she's Jewish and intervenes. And when Mordechai is trying to convince her to intervene, he says, look, if you don't get involved now, we're still going to be saved. But you're going to be losing your place in history. And the question is, okay, so why can't you say, well, fine, why risk my life? Let someone else save us. And the short answer is, history could still look very different. For example, it could be half the Jewish population be wiped out before we're saved. There's many possible pathways. They're not all the same. It's not the same story with a different actor.
Is that the idea of like the multiverse?
It's not the same. A multiverse theory typically means there are in reality actual parallel things on some ontological level that are real, whatever that means. Here it doesn't have to mean that. Here it means there are almost indefinitely many possibilities, and our choice is always choosing this path, choosing this path, choosing this path. Okay? So whether there's some other worlds out there or not, in our world, there's actuality, only one path becomes actual.
Okay.
But the guarantee of God's non-faith is no matter what path we choose, one thing's guaranteed. The end will be a unification of history, the revelation of God, showing the oneness behind everything. All those things are guaranteed. Now the short face of God, so to speak, means God is responding to the micro details of the world. So everything we're doing could in principle get a response. As well as God arcing history to the big picture, he's also potentially dealing with us. We improve as people, maybe we get more blessing, maybe we change roles. Lots of micro decisions are being made that are parallel and reflective of the choices we're making, separate from how they arc into the big picture. Okay? So you've got two processes co-occurring. Says the Ramchal, right? The Ramchal says that in the first 11 chapters of Torah, we are only looking at the long face of God. There is no short face of God interacting. From Abraham onwards, they're both interacting. Now what, and he says that's why you have these long ages. And what does that mean? What does that mean? So there's two possibilities. One is that if you only had the, let's use the word inner driving force of God, the driving to oneness, only that was operating, you would have a very different set of laws of physics. But because God operates two, in parallel with them, the laws of physics work very differently. Lifespans are shorter, many different things happen that are very different. So that's one way of understanding Ramchal, that effectively in the first 11 chapters, the laws as we know them were not operating. It was a different set of laws. There is another way of understanding Ramchal, which is that's not correct. The laws as we understand them were operating, but there are two vantage points from which you can study reality. One is the inner driving force, and one is its outer. Let me give an analogy for this. You could imagine that the inner driving force is something like the general's perspective on a war. Sitting in the command room, they're not dealing with the micro details. They're dealing with the big picture. Okay, the maneuvering units have to go to the east and flank the enemy there. Now, the commanding officers on the ground have to work out which tank goes, when they go, how they get there, when the infantry interacts, what fire support you lay down, where the drones come in, where the intelligence. There's a million details to be worked out. And it may be that the general single instruction, right, takes place actually over a set of many, many processes over a long period of time. And it doesn't look like a single instruction on the ground. So the inner vision of God in the oneness may say, this should happen in the world, and when it's translated and filtered through the detailed, it might come out in all sorts of ways over a long period of time. And so on the second reading of the Ramchal, what we're studying when we study the first 11 chapters is not how things came out in the actual world, but how they were instructed in the inner world. Okay? Why would that be theologically? Because we're not at this point interested in its micro interactions, because there is no Abraham yet in the world. The family of Israel has not yet entered the world. So we're interested in the macro patterns or the macro decisions that are being made, not the micro decisions that are being made. Okay, later on we see. On either reading of the Ramchal, if you ask yourself, if a scientist studies the past, at which point should they expect to see the Torah's events mapped in? You would say from Abraham. Prior to that, you won't be able to. Why not? Because on the first reading, the laws were different. A scientist actually can only map the past, assuming the laws were the same as they are now. But if they really did change at any point, then any mapping they're going to give to the past is going to be distorted. On the second reading, the Ramchal, no, the laws were the same. And therefore what they tell us about the past is actually accurate and exactly the way it happened. But the Torah is not describing the thing the scientist is looking at. The Torah is describing the inner framing of the big decisions up there. So for example, let's say, I'll give a few examples of this. And then one outside of the days of the first 11 chapters, and then I'll talk inside the first 11 chapters. Okay? There's a Maharal. The Maharal of Prague is another very famous author, and he lived shortly, well, not far away from the time of the Ramchal, but in a very different intellectual frame. His big piece of work, what made him so famous and outstanding, is he took upon himself the project of demonstrating to people the rabbinic writings, especially rabbinic stories, are actually full of layers of depth, and he showed a systematic way of decoding their stories, what they're really trying to get at. And this big project was to really demonstrate the depth behind what we call Chazal, the Talmudic and Midrashic rabbinic ways of talking. And he has one of his first pieces of work he produced is called the Gevuras Hashem, the strength of the might of God, and it's essentially all about the festival of Pesach. But in there he has 3 introductions, because he's not just introducing this work, he's kind of introducing his meta project. And his second introduction discusses how miracles work in a natural world. He's a believer in the rigidity of the laws of physics and nature, and he asks the question how miracles work. And in essence he says, he gives different dynamics as to how miracles work, but what he says is really miracles stem from the inner world, differentiating from the outer world. Sometimes the inner world overrides the outer world. The outer world always rigidly translates and mediates itself through the rules of what we call today physics. But sometimes the inner world can override the outer world. And then he says, but sometimes the inner world decision doesn't penetrate to the outer world. And then, depending on your consciousness, a normal human consciousness will not see the miracle. But somebody who's plugged in deeply enough will perceive the miracle. And he gives an example. In Joshua, the book of Joshua, in chapter 10, it discusses the battle with the Amorites in southern Israel, and how at one point Joshua is pursuing them in the Elah Valley, and he prays to God. The sun is setting, and he knows his soldiers will lose the ability to pursue once the sun sets, especially through all the valleys where they're not familiar with the terrain, and that means that the enemy armies will regroup, and there's still enough power they could cause a lot of problems. So he asks God to let the sun stand still, and the sun stands still. Right, we discussed that miracle. And the Maharal suggests that it's very possible that to the Amorites the sun had set, and they were groping around in the darkness, and to the Israelites the sun was up there. How is that possible? Because God deparalleled what normally works in parallel, the inner from the outer workings, and in the inner world the instruction was the light stays on, and in the outer world it went dark. And if you were on enough of a spiritual level, you could switch your perceptual apparatus and connect to the inner world and not the outer world. And so the Israelites almost had the opposite of what you use with night vision goggles. They had like a night vision mind, like a mind connected, plugging in differently, so a different perceptual apparatus, and there was a dissonance between these two levels. That's what the Maharal says. And so they were walking around with pure vision, and the other guys were walking around in the dark, and if you were on Earth, a normal person would see the sun setting. So there can be, in other words, a difference between what's going on in the inner world and the outer world. Now let's talk about the flood. It is possible that it was a local flood. It is possible it was a global flood, and the laws of physics were different. It is possible it's a global flood, but it was happening miraculously and not through the normal H2O, and therefore didn't leave proper traces in the world. There's some kind of miraculous reconstruction of societies, and how would that be contained? Lots of things you could say. But the Ramchal, I think, would tell us that's not necessarily what's happening. The Ramchal would say either the laws were just totally different, in which case I'll study the past and won't find what's going on. Or on the second reading, no. In the inner world, there was a sense that the world needs to be flooded, and an instruction came through to flood and dissolve reality and preserve the Noah. In the outer world, that might not have manifested as a single event. It might have manifested as many events over a reasonably large space and time that collectively reshaped humanity, and in some sense, Noah and his family, who survived one of those floods, a key one, was actually able to impact eventually the whole world. That's perfectly plausible. I don't know if that's the correct way to read the Torah, because Rabbi doesn't put it into detail, right? Now, what we do know is about 4,200 years ago, all of civilizations across the world seemed to simultaneously collapse. That's interesting. We also know every civilization seems to have a flood story, so we can get a sense that this stuff something was happening, some of it at one point in time, some of it over other points in time, so it's perfectly possible. Again, I'm not saying this is what happened. Ramchal doesn't give us enough detail. We can just speculate. Now that we have certain geological information, we can try and put the two and two together. Tower of Babel can be a very similar point. In the inner world is an instruction, diversify human language, culture, and so on. That may be a macro process in our world that experienced over enormous periods of time. The evolution, for example, of the language of Indo-European, right, might be the end of that long process of a single Babel event, right? So, and there may be a particular event within it that is the most tied to that macro picture. The way the Torah expresses all this is when they leave the Garden of Eden, they arrive in a zone called Kedem. And eventually they leave this, which literally means before. So Eden means time. We discussed last week the Garden of Time. Kedem is like before. And they only leave that. Now we often translate that the lands of the east. Why do we call the east before? Because it's where the sun rises from. Right? So it's like former lands. They see the sun first. But they leave this zone called Kedem only at the end of the story of the Tower of Babel. So there could be some kind of merging of inner and outer, and it comes together fully only with the advent of Abraham. So I apologize, I don't have a fully worked out theory of exactly how to line which event with what. But the reason I'm saying all of this is because it's very important to understand one way or another, assuming Ramchal is a credible source, which I don't think any Orthodox Jew will deny that, an extremely credible source. And when he's talking about this, he's not doing it to deflect questions from science, because he was talking long before modern science comes on the scene and talking based on an understanding of Talmud and Kabbalah and all of this stuff, philosophy. We do not expect the first 11 chapters to tell us the same story that we expect science to tell us. We expect it to be real events, but primarily, at least on the second reading, about the inner, something happens in the inner world to dissolve the world and restart it, and that will have manifestation in the outer world. Something happens in the inner world to diversify the consciousness of humanity into multilingual frameworks and multicultural, and that will have impact in the outer world. But we don't expect to find, and something happens in each generation that's got some number in the inner world that will manifest in something in the outer world, whether it's a civilization rather than an individual. Who knows? But the reason I say this is we're not saying you don't take the Torah literally, but Ramchal is saying you have to understand the frame of reference Torah is using. Don't expect it to be the same as the frame of reference of our standard consciousness until Abraham walks in there. Yeah.
I apologize if you mentioned this before and I missed it, but I'm struggling to understand what you mean between the outer world and the inner world.
Okay. So when I was speaking to Ramchal about the big face and small face, And the big faces that are, one of the jobs of the big faces to arc history to things to get to, means the meta decisions are all made in the inner world, right? The outer world translates those decisions into micro details, okay? So I gave the analogy, the general sits in the commanding officer and says, do this. The micro details that do this might not be, that sounds like a single decision in 1 minute. But in the micro, that may translate into many, many, many detailed decisions that take place over quite a long period of time. Okay? In a similar way, God may say, this has to now happen. And now the general's decision really, really, really happens. But if you were studying the general's decision as if they were a commander on the battlefield, you would have a completely wrong picture of what's going on.
Then what is the inner world?
Okay, so the inner world is, Kabbalistically, we speak about at least four layers from God's will down to us. Okay, that's essentially roughly what the inner worlds are. In the Torah, you see 6 days of creation take place in a level that Rashi, for example, calls the mind of God. There's a level called the Garden of Eden. There's a level called Kedem, and then there's our world as we have it. Events are occurring in each of them. Now, an event in the inner has a massive effect on the outer. In fact, an event in the inner world touches the whole outer world. Just like the general single decision touches enormous millions of soldiers, potentially, hundreds of thousands of soldiers spread over many, many, days, months, years, even something. The leader of a country's decision, go to war and achieve aim A and B, which again, if a historian thought that was a battlefield decision, might think that whole thing was meant to happen in a single day, right? But that may take years to implement, right? Over hundreds of thousands of decisions and processes and so on that happen in the micro-translation. So you could study the Prime Minister's decision, the Cabinet's decision, the General's decision, as long as you realize that's up here, right? That's not the same as studying the battlefield dynamics and expecting to see exactly the same thing. And instead you'll see many, many, many events that achieve the final result. Okay? So that's why it's very difficult, according to Ramchal, to translate the Torah's events and what the scientists are looking for in the outer world. Now, what I'm saying is, and I gave two different reasons, that could be the other alternative, the laws actually change, right? In which case, again, science wouldn't have the tools to see what the Torah says. Okay, either way, you're not expecting those first 11 chapters to give us the data in the frame of translation that the Torah gives us, that the science gives us. They're going to be two different ways of studying the same data. Interestingly enough, our calendar already begins that. So it's like our calendar is mapping events in the inner frame, and then it's mapping events in the outer frame, and we run them as if they're seamless. So that's obviously very important, which means the inner events are real, and there is a relevant time frame in which they are occurring, but it may not be the same time, and then it transitions into our time frame, right? So there's what to work out in the details of this approach. I don't know anyone who's done a full detailed work. I have an ambition one day to try and do it, but we'll have to study an enormous amount of the literature Ramchal was basing on, try and get some kind of retrospective methodology for doing it. Okay? But that's the meta point on most of the question that came up here is the assumption that the frame of reference is the same as a modern scientist's frame of reference is not true. Once we get to Avraham, it is true. And then we should expect to see correlations. Yeah.
How's positing the inner world any different than the multiverse theory? Because you have equally poor evidence for both.
So the evidence for anything in Torah claims starts from the Torah being true. Right? In other words,
I'm saying when the Ramchal says there's an inner world and an outer world, we see the outer world, we have it.
Yeah.
Saying when we see our reality, we have it.
Yeah.
And when Ramchal says there's an inner world,
yeah.
I mean, I personally don't have any access to the inner world. I assume the Ramchal doesn't either.
Yeah.
So,
Where does he get it from?
yeah.
See, ultimately it comes from the Torah. Right? So Kabbalah is a study of Torah. It comes from
Kabbalah
Kabbalah.
also doesn't say there's an inner world.
Well, it depends how you read the Garden of Eden, for example.
Right.
As we said last week, the Hebrew word Eden, well, for example, interestingly enough, they only get garments of skin when they leave Eden. Okay, now it could say it's leather clothing, but the most natural reading is it's a trans-physical realm. The fact that the word Eden itself means time, and it's a garden of all time, and Adam means humanity. If you just put the literal meaning of the words together, you're getting a higher dimension of reality, what we call in modern language a higher dimension of the same reality. Right? If the Torah seems to frame the purpose of the world to return to that level, and then we're getting the sense that is in and outer. When Ezekiel, Yechezkel, chapter 1 and chapter 10, and Yeshayahu early on as well, in chapter 6 there is, I think, have these visions of the inner workings of the throne room and all these things. They're talking about inner world, right? So we do have discussion of inner world in Tanakh. According to Maimonides, because the Rambam, an angel is not something you can fully encounter in the outer world. So every discussion then is contacting something on the inner level. The Malach literally means a messenger device between the inner and the outer. And the way Eliyahu's consciousness works when he has a prophecy seems to work the same way. It goes through multiple layers. So we have lots of indications just from Tanakh that there are inner layers behind reality. The full explication of them, the Kabbalistic model uses, that might need some extrapolation. But ultimately it's rooted back into those visions, for example. So Tanakh does give us a sense there's an inner and outer levels of reality. There's a throne room of God. Before there's a world called Ophanim. There's a world called Chayos. There's all these sorts of layers happening. You can hear Kadosh, 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 and so on. There's a lot happening in this stuff. And that's ultimately the basis of it. Okay? So, and in the philosophical dimension of this, the logic behind the philosophy of it is that the understanding that we meet at Sinai, where God says the first two commandments in the first person, and then switches the third person. You have the bit where the Torah itself says that people say to Moshe, we can't deal with God anymore, you intervene, right? Which implies that a full direct revelation of God is something very difficult for conscious beings to sustain. Not easy. Because ultimately a revelation of God is a revelation that we are just figments of God's imagination. And that makes sense that there'll be intervening systems, whether they're angels, whether they're other things, that allow for God's will to flow into the world with barriers and not in a direct access of us and God. So those are the clues before we then start exploring Kabbalah, which will then try to systematize that and give meanings to various words that the prophets use and explain what they are and all the systematic stuff that comes with it. Okay. Any other questions on all of this? Yeah.
Is there a theory that there is a multiverse type of system within Judaism, or is that not a...
So what modern physicists mean by a multiverse, I'm not aware of an actual discussion in Judaism. Okay, but except that some of the medieval commentators, when they try to reconcile God's knowledge and free will, seem to tilt towards the possibility of every possible outcome is also there. So that's how God can know everything. That's not the primary way of resolving the problem. If you say that, you might have realism about all possible worlds. There is a problem built into... Now, some multiverses are really just bifurcations of one system that branches at various points, but there's always finite possibilities, and all of them are real on some level. That, I don't think Torah has a comment one way or the other. Those who want to say a multiverse means every single possible thing is actualized, there's an actual mathematical problem with that. There's no clear way of even defining what all possible means, right? Because of the way that mathematics deals with the real number line, you cannot even really intelligibly, if you actually had lots of different universes in some conceptual space somewhere, theoretically you should be able to line them up so every single one of them could have a number and they could stand in relation to one another. But mathematically that doesn't exhaust all possibilities. No matter what algorithmic system you use, you can always have more possibilities between them. So all possible is probably a category error anyway. But if you mean bifurcates to fixed set of possibilities, it could be. What Kabbalists speak of in many, many worlds is not really many parallel worlds to ours, is that between the will of God and us are many layers, right? Sometimes they cluster them into four, paralleling the four names of God, paralleling the four levels that are seen in the vision of Ezekiel, paralleling the four stages in creation, from 7 days of creation to Eden to Kedem to Upyan. So you get this four structure working all the way through. And so they often talk about four worlds. They have names for them, paralleling the primary creation verbs. Bria, which parallels the one level. You have a name even higher than that, like Tzilas, just the pure name of God. Then you have the Bria, and the Yetzirah, and the Asiyah, which are all verbs that appear in the creation chapter. And the realms where they're predominant will be differentiated from one another. Okay, so these are all things they talk about.
I don't know if you were going to dive into something else, in which case you don't have to answer this, but I mentioned earlier, like, how do we reconcile, our ability to choose with God being all known.
Right, and there were other questions as well. There was a question about giants, just so you know about giants. The Torah never gives us a size of giants. We have size in the rabbinic text. The idea that people who are very tall, we absolutely well tested, not in genetics and in archaeology. And we do have, I think, in the Golan, certain places where they found these enormous length spears, which are very difficult to explain if they weren't very large people. But these visions you get in the rabbinic writing of 10 amos, Moses is 10, it's like 5 meters high, jumping 5 meters to the 5 meters, sort of hitting the ankle. The Maharal would say, if that's not what those numbers mean, they're always symbolic numbers in rabbinic writings. Right? Tanakh, they can also be literal. In rabbinic writings, they're typically symbolic numbers, and so it's not necessarily making the claim there was somebody actually there. Right? So the numbers given in Tanakh, we actually have a full physical size of them, but so that's not implausible because no reason to say the rules of nature being broken over this. Yeah.
The last question about the ark, for Jake's question,
Yeah.
and it may have already been answered with the rules were different back then, was just talking about the different kosher animals and non-kosher animals that came on the ark. I understand that we've uncovered potentially a Noah's Ark somewhere in Turkey.
This is very difficult to know because the groups that claim to have found the Ark of Noah in Turkey, there's always a suspicious around the evangelical Christians, they have an agenda. Has it been published in peer review thing? No, it's very difficult to access the sites they claim to do proper forensic research, but my suspicion is that if pure forensic research wasn't done, there'd be a lot more discussion about it, right, in mainstream archaeology. I know that people want to say that the archaeological community is primarily biased about being anti-religious. There are definitely lots of people with agendas, but there's plenty of religious Christians who are phenomenal archaeologists, and even some Orthodox Jews. I think that data would get published, and that people have different theories. See, critics would say maybe Noah's Ark was based on the fact that people went up the mountain and saw that thing. So I'm very skeptical about it. Why there isn't strong peer review literature if there really is some wood sitting up there in Turkey. It wouldn't even be against the Turkish government's interest because even the Quran has references to this stuff. So it wouldn't be. It's not like they're suppressing it. So I would be very skeptical. It doesn't mean it's not true, but I'd be very skeptical about it. Yeah.
There's so many stories, and you talked about it, that we can't tell if they were in this reality or another, or they happened in a different way than it's written, in a very different way. For you saying, it seems to have happened in a very different way than it's written. With the Garden Eden, it probably happened that you mentioned. So where does that stop?
Okay. So according to Ramchal, it stops in the section we call Lech Lecha. It stops in chapters-wise after the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Okay, from that point, we're really zooming in to people we can recognize in the frame and the same laws that we can recognize, the same frame of reference we can recognize. That's from Abraham onward. Now, when a prophet goes and acts as a prophecy, their consciousness may be elevated beyond the world that we can recognize, right? So the images they see have to be interpreted back into our world. That's a typical example. So, for example, if they see a lion striking down a structure, that may manifest in our world as the Babylonian Empire over a period of time destroying something. That's a typical difference between the inner and the outer world. But the first 11 chapters, and according to Maimonides, every encounter with an angel is some kind of shift into the inner world, but accessible from the outer world. But according to the Ramchal, the first 11 chapters are not framed in the way in our reference systems would identify the outer world translation.
Just it just seems so confusing. I know that it's it's hard to see, it's grand design and everything. But do you have a theory for why those first 11 chapters are so
different? Yeah, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Sure, because it's before there's any Torah in the world. So the goal of Torah in the beginning is not to give you a detailed history of the micro events happening on planet Earth. It's to give you a history of the fundamental things that were going on. At some point, humanity emerges. At some point, humanity is deconstructed and reconstructed around the framework through Noah originally, but that may spread all over the world. And at some point, there needs to be a differentiation of the world. Those three events are real instructions in the real world that really change the way the world operates in a profound way. Those cover everything. The generations also like that. So it's like, it's a bit like historians will often say, oh, Rome conquered this, oh, this happened here, like as if it's a single event, because we're just trying to get to now we're going to the details of where every chapter, where every sentence is now a few seconds rather than a few thousand years or something. That's presumably the theological reason that I would say. Okay. Yes, I'm going to start. Yeah, go on.
I just wanted to ask you your humble opinion of the information, especially when it comes to Kabbalah and all the books going around, like Islam, Hanok, and stuff like that. In us in the environment that we're in, do you think it's positive for us to be able to learn and understand those things, to be able to really understand what some of the guys wanting to understand the inner world, what that really means and how we connect to that? Do you think it is a positive thing for us to know and to connect those sorts of things? Even if we have some in English, non-English, and Hebrew, it's hard to understand.
I would say this. Throughout history, there's been debates about this stuff because it's extremely easy to misunderstand it.
Right.
Some people would argue almost the vast majority of people who study this material misunderstand it. Right? And misunderstanding can lead to fundamental theological issues. And so that I think is less of a problem nowadays, even if, as long as people are very strongly aware that every picture you have is false. Because the closer you get to God, the more using an outer world, three-dimensional, spatiotemporal picture is going to produce a false outcome. Just like every time we think about God's motivation, we're always projecting humanity onto it, and therefore it comes out messed up. As long as you're aware of that, and this is the Rambam emphasizing the Guide for the Perplexed, which is a non-Kabbalistic work, trying to achieve the same goal. As long as you're very aware of that, well trained in that, then abstract pictures and so on won't confuse you in a very damaging way. The other problem with studying Kabbalistic texts is they can lead to an imbalanced sense of what things mean, right? First of all, they can lead a person to start to behave very differently to halacha, because Zohar will sometimes talk about things this sounds very different to halachic system. You have to remember Kabbalah is talking about the inner world, not the outer world. So for example, if Kabbalah says you have to grow your beard, but halacha says you just can't use a blade against the face, that's debated in halacha exactly what the parameters that are. So some people will grow a beard, that's a very Hasidic reaction, because as I said so. In the Lithuanian world, it's typical, at least until marriage, that people will use some form of how do they do it? The Zohar has said, because we follow halacha. Halacha is the rule for the outer world. So what's a beard in the inner world? You know what that is? It turns out to be the midas harachamim, that translates between the inner vision, perception things, and how we articulate. Just the beard is the translation between our mind, if you like, and our mouth. So you may see faults in somebody, but that's the wrong thing to communicate. Right, so we have to grow that. You understand? Now, some people say yes. So that's just a small example. It can lead to imbalance. And other things, the Zohar will sometimes talk about the terrible consequences of certain sins. And it leads people to feel immense shame and immense guilt, especially in sexual areas, right? Wasting seed unleashes demons and all this kind of stuff. And you can have that people who really struggle with that and end up with they don't want to do it, but it's very compelling, and they sometimes fall short of their ideal, and then they sit there believing they're killing people all over the world, right? And you have to understand, inner world and outer world are not the same reality. We're responsible for the outer world. It's helpful to know some things in the inner world. We've got to put everything into its proportion. That's separate from some controversies over to which parts are authentic, not authentic. That's a whole separate. So assuming everything is authentic and everything is real, you've got to know how to learn it and how not to learn it. And finding, and there's different approaches, there isn't a unanimous approach around these topics. Even what I just said to you now, I think agree with it, right? So that's why, for all those reasons, there's a cautionary tale around the study of abstract, esoteric, interdimensional works. At the same time, in our generations, already stretching back for a while, there seems to be a thirsting for it. And therefore, it's not wise to tell people not to do it. If their soul is pulling towards it, the desire for abstraction and spiritual connectedness, all these things that often come more easily with it, it can be the right thing for people to do. It's just it needs to be done in a responsible way, that's all. And there's plenty of people today who can teach responsibly. There's books that are done responsibly on it. So it won't necessarily be one answer for everybody, that would be the general.
If you have recommendations, could you send them in the chat?
I'm not in the chat, but I would say that look, there's a lot of competent people even in this building who can really teach a lot of this material in a healthy way. Rav Aryeh Kaplan is generally considered to be a very good starting source. Rav Adin Steinsaltz. There's a few people who write introductory material. I think Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan wrote In a Space, for example, a few works like that. He himself was very into lots of things, Breslov, Chassidus, and so on, with very grounded and multidisciplinary approach to it, which is probably a good starting place for getting the very basics. Ramchal's Derech Hashem, translated into English, is an excellent classical source, right? You're really in the classical material at that point, but in a very readable format. They can give it. But again, you've got to understand. Later on, you should read his Das Tivunos, that's not the name he gave to it, the manuscript they published, where he literally describes all the Kabbalistic systems without using any of their words as a philosophical framework. So when you put the two together, you start to get a sense, a preparatory sense to go further. But some people get blown away by Rav Nachman of Breslov teaching. Some people love learning the Tanya and the Hasidic world. Some people love learning Rav Kook. Some people love learning the Nefesh HaChaim and the more how does a Litvische philosophy come out of Kabbalah, rigidity and focus on observance of Allah, on studying Torah. That's also derivable. So there's lots of different avenues and ways to do it. It's good to start with teachers and people who have a strong perspective and who you trust their ability to be grounded and help ground people in doing it. But within that, there's enormous amounts of pathways today, journeying through the material, starting to. It's a universe of material. It's not a single sort. Yeah. Okay. I've not gone back to the free will question. I'll give a touch upon it, and we'll see if we need more elaboration in the future. I know there's still other questions we need to settle around. Okay, we've got, I think, at least one more week together in this cycle. I believe it's a 4-week cycle, so next week we'll have to make sure. I did actually say we'll probably do a whole session on the Garden of Eden week. No, we haven't done that yet, so it could be we'll do a lot of material out and then try and answer the remaining questions. Very roughly, when we are bothered by God knowing the future, it's because what we're doing is we are imagining a human knowing the future. Humans live inside space and time. So if a human is able to access today your decision tomorrow or in a month's time or in a year's time, that means there must be facts in the world today that predetermine that event, then you'll never have free will when the event comes up to choose differently. That's the problem. So we kind of imagine God sitting inside the world today, looking around the facts of the world today, and therefore seeing what you're going to do before you get the moment to make a free will choice. But the moment that arises, you can't choose differently. But God's perspective of reality is going to be fundamentally different to ours. And therefore it's not going to be that problem. Let's start with I'm going to give you 2 models of God's perspective. The first one, which isn't true, but is true enough to show you even there wouldn't be a problem. And that's simply the model of us looking back on the past. Right? If you let's suppose you have full free will, and you made a decision to walk through the door that you might not have made, and it was really possible for you to make 2 decisions. I now know that you walked through that door. So my perspective now, going back to an hour ago, is I know what you did. Does that impact your free will? No. Obviously not, because my knowledge is an effect of your decision, not a cause of it. Right? So now just imagine being outside of time, able to view the whole of time. The being's not inside time. It sees all the free will choices. Right? Its knowledge of them is similar to our knowledge of the past. So that being, which is not the same as God's perspective, but even that being would not cause by, on the one hand, you'd say it knows the event that we currently call the future. But it doesn't know the future. It's never stuck inside time looking ahead. It's completely outside of time. From this being's perspective, everything is already there and it knows it. From our perspective, the future hasn't happened and therefore it doesn't yet know it. Right? The only problem is when you try and mix those 2 perspectives. And God's knowledge is going to be even different to that. When we start to use the language about God's knowledge, we're going to get stuck. But God's knowledge is not even going to be learning about the world. Somehow God's mind causes everything, including the free will beings and their free will choices. We cannot imagine that. But even that intermediary perspective I gave is enough to show that it's possible to have a perspective that knows everything without interfering at all with our free will. Okay? It's just when you mix the 2 perspectives, you get stuck. Like lots of paradoxes. Okay, with that, we've hit 12 o'clock. I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to stick around for a few minutes if you have more questions, and also, please God, next week we will be able to get together.